Vrei Solane had answered 11 credible deathworld threat calls in 4 years on the real Verge border, and 11 times the threat had turned out to be something else entirely. A dockworker with a bad heart valve who'd collapsed mid-shift and been mistaken, by a jumpy junior clerk, for a human going feral. A crate of improperly labeled agricultural enzymes that had eaten through its own container and set off a corrosion alarm 2 decks from the human berths. A boy of 9 who had climbed into a ventilation duct on a dare and gotten stuck, and whose muffled shouting had been logged, with admirable bureaucratic seriousness, as unidentified vocalization, possible hostile intent, Sector 4. She had stopped expecting anything at the 12th call. That was, she would later understand, the exact frame of mind the threshold-conquered border directorate trained into every compliance enforcer who served the Deathworld crossings long enough to stop flinching at the file tag itself. And it was also, she would come to think, the precise blind spot the whole apparatus had built for itself out of nothing but repetition and relief. Vrei was Ithran, which meant she had grown up on a homeworld where patience was not a virtue so much as a caste marker. Ithran children were raised from their first schooling years to prize the slow, procedural resolution of conflict, a cultural inheritance so deep that Ithran military doctrine still described emotional escalation as a documented failure state rather than a natural response to be managed. It made Ithrans excellent administrators, adequate diplomats, and by the private admission of nearly every Ithran enforcer Vrei had ever served beside mediocre judges of a threat that didn't announce itself through the channels and Ithran had been trained to watch for, because a mind built on procedure looked instinctively for procedural tells. Raised voices, sudden movement, the visible tremor of someone losing composure. She had requested the real Verge border posting 9 years into her directorate career specifically, because it was considered, by her homeworld's own quiet standards, an unglamorous and slightly beneath her assignment. Human origin traffic mostly, Deathworld refugees and undocumented crossers, a caseload her mother had once described, not unkindly, over a calm connection thin enough to strip the warmth out of the sentiment, as processing people who never learned to want anything gracefully. Vrei had never found a way to explain to her mother that this was exactly why she had stayed 9 years past her first rotation option, instead of transferring somewhere with better postings and cleaner statistics. The people who came through Corval Waypoint had never had the luxury of an Ithran childhood's procedural patience, and something in her, some part of her that her homeworld's training had never quite finished sanding down, had always wanted to understand at close range what that actually cost a person, rather than reading the cost second-hand in a settlement classification file, the way the rest of her caste seemed content to. She kept, in a drawer in her small station office, a chip of her own unfinished doctoral application from before she'd enlisted, a proposed study on adaptive threat perception across Deathworld origin populations that she had abandoned 3 years into the directorate for reasons she still hadn't fully admitted to herself. And she told herself, most days, that the fieldwork she did now was close enough to the study she'd never written that the abandonment didn't matter. Most days she almost believed it. The 12th call came in at the tail end of a 14-hour shift, routed through Corval Waypoint's intake desk with the flat, unremarkable priority code the directorate reserved for paperwork rather than danger. One unregistered minor, human origin, intercepted crossing the real Verge exclusion boundary without transit documentation, currently held in holding block C pending standard processing. Vrei read it twice at her desk console, mostly out of habit, and found nothing in it that distinguished it from the 4 dozen similar tags she'd closed that quarter. A girl, no listed guardian, no manifest, no ship registry, no explanation for how a 14-year-old had crossed 9 light-years of contested border space alone, which was the only genuinely interesting detail in the whole file, and even that detail she filed privately under logistics rather than danger. Children cross the verge undocumented more often than the conquered's public statistics like to admit. Refugees riding cargo manifests they weren't listed on. Runaways. The occasional smuggled indenture the directorate was supposed to intercept and rarely did in time. It was, in Vrei's 4 years of experience, a sad category of file, and almost never a dangerous one. She finished the last 20 minutes of her shift processing a genuinely more urgent matter, a fuel manifest discrepancy on a Ferrasi cargo hauler that had nearly gotten someone's hand caught in a coupling, and did not think about the girl in holding Block C again, until first-rank Enforcer Dorn Kalich found her in the equipment corridor on his way out. Moving with the particular unhurried confidence of a man who had already decided how a conversation was going to go before he started it. "You caught the Deathworld intake," he said. It wasn't a question. Kalich outranked her by 1 grade and 11 years of seniority, and he had a way of delivering information back to a person as though he were doing them a courtesy by confirming it. "Corvi processing once it cleared before the transit window closes tomorrow. I'll take point on the assessment if you want it off your board." "It's a minor with no documentation," Vrei said. "That's a guardian trace and a repatriation referral, not an assessment." "It's a Deathworld origin minor with no documentation," Kalich corrected, mild as ever, crossing a live exclusion boundary alone, with no vessel record and no explanation for how she got there. "That's exactly the profile the classification bulletin flagged 8 months ago. You read the bulletin." She had read the bulletin. Every compliance enforcer on the real verge had read the bulletin, a dry, carefully worded directorate memorandum on resilience marker origin populations that used the phrase elevated adaptive baseline 9 times without once using the word the memorandum was actually circling, which was valuable. Valuable to the handful of licensed bioresearch consortia who paid the directorate's unregistered asset processing fee for access to exactly this category of undocumented arrival before repatriation paperwork could establish a claimant. Vrei had never personally routed anyone through that channel. She had heard in the particular unofficial way enforcers heard things, that Kalich had twice, both times with clean paperwork and no complaint filed, both times with a small, unremarkable bonus appearing in his quarterly commendation, record under a category vague enough not to invite questions. "She's 14, Vrei said. "The bulletin doesn't set a floor," Kalich said, which was true, and which she had heard almost exactly those words used to defend almost exactly this kind of decision before, in a different context, about a different species, and had not liked it that time either. "I'll run the standard intake interview myself in the morning." "You don't need to be there for it." "I'll be there for it," Vrei said, and did not examine, right then, why the sentence came out of her with more edge in it than the situation obviously required. She mentioned it anyway, later that evening, to Corporal Bellamy Thrace, a station logistics officer she'd shared a mess table with often enough over 4 years to call something close to a friend, mostly because Thrace had a flat, uncomplicated way of talking about the directorate's internal politics that Vrei's own Ithran instincts still sometimes needed translated for her. "Kalich wants a fast close on a minor's file," she said, over a meal neither of them was eating with much attention. "Wants to run the assessment himself. I don't like the shape of it." "You never like the shape of anything Kalich runs," Thrace said, not unkindly, turning a ration bar over in his hands without opening it. "He's not wrong about the bulletin, though. It's a real classification. Ugly but real. If she trips it, he's got cover. She's 14, and she's got a documented ANT3 transit days from here." "Then it's a fast case," Thrace said, with the particular shrug of a man who had learned, over a long career, to save his outrage for things he could actually change. "Fast cases don't usually need a second enforcer sitting in on the interview, Vrei. You know that better than I do." "I know it," she agreed, and didn't have a better answer for him than the one she didn't say out loud, which was that she had read 4 dozen files that quarter with exactly this shape and felt nothing about any of them. And this one, for reasons she couldn't yet put a procedural label on, had already gotten under whatever careful Ithran patience she used instead of a nerve. Holding Block C was the waypoint's smallest, reserved for cases the Directorate didn't consider dangerous enough to warrant the secure block, and didn't consider harmless enough to release into general transit housing. A narrow half-corridor of 8 cells with clear polymer fronts instead of bars, more waiting room than prison. And it was, on the morning Vrei walked into it with a data slate, and 11 years of experience telling her exactly what to expect. Occupied by exactly one small girl sitting, cross-legged on the cell's single cot with her back very straight, and her hands folded in her lap, watching the corridor with the calm, unhurried attention of someone who had already counted every exit twice and filed the information away without any particular urgency. She was small for 14. Vrei checked the intake record twice to be sure of the age, because the girl in front of her could have passed for 11 in dim light, thin-boned, sandy-haired, dressed in a patched 2-piece travel suit that had clearly been re-hemmed at least once to fit a smaller frame than it was originally cut for. Nothing about her matched the profile in Kalich's bulletin. She did not look feral, did not look dangerous, did not look, in any respect Vrei's 4 years of border experience had trained her to recognize as a threat indicator, like anything other than a tired, watchful, unaccompanied child who had clearly not slept properly in some days, and was doing an excellent job of not letting that show. Lark Dunmore, the girl said, before Vrei had finished reading the name off the slate, in the flat, economical trade standard of someone who'd learned it functionally rather than at leisure. "You're going to ask my name first. It's Lark Dunmore. I already told the intake officer twice." "I read the transcript," Vrei said, and set the slate down on the small fixed table outside the cell's open front. The waypoint didn't lock holding Block C during interviews. Another small tell about how the Directorate itself classified the risk level of this particular room, and sat, rather than standing over the girl the way Kalich would have. "I'm not here to ask it a third time. I'm here because the officer who ran your first interview flagged your file for reassessment, and I wanted to see the flag myself before I signed off on it." Something in the girl's face didn't change so much as go very still, the specific stillness of a person recalculating how much a new piece of information cost them. Reassessment for what? "I don't know yet," Vrei said, which was true, and which she watched land on the girl the way true things generally did on people who had learned the hard way to distrust anyone who answered too smoothly. "Tell me how you crossed the boundary, not the interview version. The real one." Lark looked at her for a long moment, not with fear, which Vrei had expected and had spent 4 years learning to read past, but with the particular assessing patience of someone deciding whether an adult in front of her was a category worth investing honesty in, a look far older than the small, tired face wearing it. "I walked 11 kilometers to a supply relay my grandfather used to trade with," she said finally, "and I told the freight pilot running it that I'd pay for passage once I reached my aunt, and he believed me because my grandfather's name was still good with him, and he dropped me at the verge boundary marker with a note telling the first conquered post I found that I wasn't running from anything, I was running to someone. That's the whole story. I don't have documentation because Kestrel Hollow's registry office burned down 11 days before I left, along with most of the settlement records, and the freight pilot isn't a smuggler. He's just old and kind, and didn't have the paperwork to formally sponsor a passenger. So I have no vessel manifest with my name on it and no colonial ID card to show you, and I understand exactly how that looks." "Why did the registry office burn down?" The stillness in the girl's face deepened by one further degree, and for the first time since Vrei had walked into the block, something moved behind the calm, not panic, nothing so loud as panic, but a controlled, deliberate closing, like a door being eased shut rather than slammed. That's a longer answer, Lark said. I'd rather give it to you once, to whoever actually decides what happens to me, instead of twice to people deciding whether I'm worth listening to first. Vrei sat with that for a moment, turning it over because it was, she recognized slowly, not evasion. It was economy. The girl was rationing a story she clearly did not want to tell more than once, and rationing it with a kind of tactical clarity that had nothing to do with fear of getting caught in a lie and everything to do with simple, weary efficiency. The exact calculus of someone who had already told this story enough times, in some other context, to know exactly how much it cost her each time. I'm the one deciding what happens to your case, Vrei said, for now. I'd like to hear it. Lark studied her for a moment longer, the particular unhurried assessment of someone who had learned that trust was a resource to be spent deliberately rather than given away. And then, apparently satisfied by whatever she'd found, some of the rigid economy went out of her shoulders, not much, not enough that a less attentive observer would have caught it, but enough that Vrei did. You're not writing anything down, Lark observed. Not yet. The intake officer wrote everything down, every word, even the parts where I stopped to breathe. The intake officer was building a file, Vrei said. I'm trying to understand a person. Those aren't always the same exercise, whatever the forms want us to believe. Something that wasn't quite a smile moved at the corner of the girl's mouth, there and gone before it fully arrived. My grandfather used to say something like that, about forms. She glanced down at her own hands, folded again in her lap, and added almost as an aside, he'd have liked you, I think. He didn't like most conquered officers, said most of them had never had to learn the difference between a form that protects somebody and a form that just protects the person filling it out. And which is this one? Vrei asked, nodding at the data slate on the table. I don't know yet, Lark said. That's why I'm still talking to you, instead of just answering your questions. She heard it in pieces over the following hour, and by the end of it she had stopped taking notes, because the shape of the story had stopped being the kind of thing that needed a slate to remember. Kestrel Hollow was a border settlement 4 transit days past the last formally garrisoned conquered post on the real verge. 1,100 people spread across a mining township and its surrounding farm holds, on a world the Directorate's own settlement classification listed, with a bureaucratic blandness that did no justice to the reality of it, as elevated hazard, provisional conquered protection, Tier 3. Tier 3 meant a single rotating conquered liaison officer with no standing garrison, a response time from the nearest actual peacekeeping force measured in transit days rather than hours, and a raid history that the Directorate's own regional office tracked in a database Vrei had never had reason to open until that afternoon. When she pulled it and found Kestrel Hollow listed with 6 confirmed raid incursions over the preceding 9 years, 3 of them attributed to a border syndicate operating out of unclaimed space along the verge's outer edge and known, in Directorate incident reports, as the Scarrow Combine. The 7th incursion, 11 days before Lark Dunmore walked into a conquered border post and asked to be processed as a documented arrival, had hit the township's central registry office directly, along with the grain cooperative's storage silos and the settlement's single medical clinic, in a raid pattern the incident summary described. Again with a blandness Vrei found herself, reading it, actively resenting. As consistent with prior Scarrow Combine resource denial operations against Tier 3 settlements resisting tribute demands. Kestrel Hollow, the summary noted almost as an afterthought, had refused 3 prior tribute demands from the Combine over the preceding 2 years, organizing its own perimeter defense instead, coordinated by a settlement council that the file identified. In a single line Vrei read 4 times before she was certain she'd understood it correctly, as having been chaired for the preceding decade by a man named Lark Dunmore. He was your grandfather, Vrei said, when she went back to the cell that evening with a ration pack Lark hadn't asked for, and a question she hadn't planned to ask that directly. "He raised me," Lark said. "My mother died when I was 3. It was mostly him after that." She was sitting in the same position she'd been sitting in that morning, straight-backed on the cot, but something in her had loosened by a fraction over the course of the day, enough that when she reached for the ration pack her hand didn't move with quite the same tight, economical control it had that morning. "He was Frontier Corps before Kestrel Hollow, before I was born. He didn't talk about it much. He talked about the watch instead." "The watch?" "The long watch," Lark said, and something in her voice changed on the words, dropped into a register that was almost, but not quite, recitation, the particular cadence of a phrase repeated so many times across so many years that it had worn a groove in the person saying it. "It's not a story. It's a drill set. Terrain reading, quiet movement, how to take a hold off someone bigger than you without breaking anything you don't have to break, how to watch a room without looking like you're watching it." Every kid in Kestrel Hollow learned some version of it, starting around 5, because the Combine's raiding parties don't check ages before they decide who's a problem and who isn't. And my grandfather decided a long time before I was born that the settlement wasn't going to wait for the Concord's Tier 3 response time to figure that out the hard way a second time. She looked down at the ration pack in her hands, not eating it, just holding it. "He drilled me on it every morning before school, from when I was 5 until 11 days ago. He was very particular about it. He said the whole point of the watch was that you should never have to use it, and that the only way to make sure of that was to be good enough at it that nobody watching you could tell." The last full drill had been 4 months before the raid, on a cold spring morning with frost still furring the co-op's fence line, and Lark would spend a long time afterward turning that morning over in her memory, the way a person turns over a coin they don't remember picking up, trying to work out when exactly it had stopped being an ordinary Tuesday and started being one of the last few mornings she'd ever have with him. Lark Dunmore ran the drill the same way he'd run it since she was 5. No warning, no announcement, just a hand closing gently but without hesitation around her wrist from behind while she was crouched at the chicken coop's latch, her attention on the stubborn hinge and nowhere else. Exactly the kind of unguarded moment the drill existed to punish. "Dead," he said, in the same flat, unbothered voice he always used. No anger in it, no disappointment, just information. "What went wrong?" "I was watching the latch instead of the yard." "You were watching the latch instead of the yard," he agreed, and let go of her wrist, and settled back onto his heels the way he always did between passes. A big, weathered man built like the fence posts he'd sunk around the property himself, patient in a way that had nothing to do with an Ithran's cultivated patience, and everything to do with a man who had run this exact drill, in one form or another, for the better part of 30 years, and had stopped expecting it to be finished any time soon. "The latch will still be stuck in 4 seconds. It's been stuck for a week. It'll keep being stuck. The yard changes every 4 seconds whether you're looking at it or not, and the yard is the only one of the two that can put a hand around your wrist." He nodded at the coop. "Again, and this time if I get your wrist, you don't just tell me what went wrong. You show me what you'd have done in the half-second before I closed it." She ran it 4 more times before he was satisfied, and on the last pass, when his hand came for her wrist again, she was already turning into it instead of away, her shoulder dropping under the angle of his grip in a motion 4 months of muscle memory had finally started to make look less like a drill and more like instinct, and he let her complete the redirect this time instead of resetting her, and when she'd finished it, his own bulk half a step off balance, her small frame planted solid where his had been a moment before, he looked at her with an expression she didn't fully understand until much later, long after he was gone. Not pride exactly, or not only pride, but something closer to grief arriving early. The specific look of a man who had spent 9 years building a skill into his granddaughter that he devoutly hoped, every single morning, she would never actually need. "Good," he said, and helped her up, and did not tell her, that morning or any morning after it, that the reason he drilled her so much harder than he drilled the other Kestrel Hollow children was that he had personally buried 2 friends from the settlement's founding years who had never learned the watch at all, and had promised himself, digging the second grave, that no child under his direct responsibility was ever going to end up in one for the same reason. He told her only, as he told her most mornings, to go get ready for school, and watched her walk back toward the house with the particular unhurried attention of a man cataloging, without meaning to, every small way she had gotten better since the last time he'd looked. "And the raid," Vrei said carefully, 11 days ago. Lark was quiet for long enough that Vrei nearly withdrew the question, and then she said, in the same flat, rationed voice she'd used that morning, "He held the registry office door with 2 other council members while the rest of us got the children into the grain cellar under the co-op. That was the plan. It had worked twice before. It didn't work the 3rd time, because the Combine brought a breaching charge this time instead of hand tools, and the door wasn't built to hold against that, and he knew it wasn't built to hold against that about 4 seconds before it didn't." She set the ration pack down on the cot beside her, untouched, and for the first time all day her hands were completely still, folded in her lap in a way that looked less like composure and more like something being held down by force. "I wasn't in the cellar yet. I saw it. I'm not going to tell you the rest of that part because it doesn't change anything you need to decide about my case, and I've decided I only have to carry it, not hand it to strangers for free." Vrei did not push. She sat with the silence instead, for longer than her training strictly recommended for an intake assessment, and when she finally spoke again it was not about the raid at all. "Your aunt," she said. "Where?" "Halworth Reach. 3 transit days passed here on the civil registry. She's my mother's sister. She doesn't know I'm coming, because the relay that would have carried the message burned down with everything else. But she'll take me in, because she's the kind of person who would, and because I'm the only piece of my mother's family she has left." Lark looked up, and for the first time since Vrei had walked into the block that morning, there was something in her face that wasn't rationed calm at all, something closer to a plain, exhausted, 14-year-old's hope, briefly unguarded before the discipline closed back over it. "That's the whole request. Repatriation to a documented relative. It's not complicated. I've read the Accord's transit provisions twice since they put me in here. I qualify." "You do," Vrei said, and meant it, and did not yet know how much that answer was going to cost either of them to keep true. Kalich ran his own assessment interview the following morning, and Vrei attended it because she'd said she would, and because something about the tightness around his mouth when he saw her waiting outside holding Block C told her, before he said a word, that he had hoped she wouldn't. He was efficient about it, in the particular way Vrei had learned to distrust over 4 years of working adjacent to him. Efficient the way a form is efficient, each question landing exactly where the classification bulletin's decision tree required it to land, building toward a conclusion Vrei suspected he had already reached before he'd opened the cell front. He asked about the raid. He asked about the long watch and made Lark describe 2 of the drills in physical detail, and Vrei watched him make a note on his slate with an expression she recognized, uneasily, as satisfaction. "Describe the wrist release again," Kalich said. "Slower this time, which muscles?" "I don't know the names of the muscles," Lark said. "I know what my hands do." "Those aren't the same thing, and I don't think you're actually asking me a medical question. I'm asking you an assessment question. You're asking me to describe how to hurt someone, in enough detail that it goes in a file next to the word asset," Lark said, level, unhurried, and Vrei watched Kalich's pen still on the slate for exactly 1 beat before he continued as though she hadn't spoken at all, which told Vrei, more clearly than anything in the file so far, precisely how accurate the girl's read of the room had been. He asked, finally, whether she would consent to a standard bioassessment scan, routine for unregistered arrivals from elevated hazard origin worlds, and it was in the particular smoothness of the phrasing, routine, standard, the two words doing the work of making an invasive procedure sound like paperwork, that Vrei felt the shape of what he was actually building toward. "What's the scan for?" Vrei said, before Lark could answer. "Standard threat baseline documentation," Kalich said, not looking away from the girl. "It's in the bulletin." "It's not in the repatriation protocol," Vrei said. "She has a documented relative and a clean transit claim. The bulletin applies to unclaimed arrivals pending asset review, not documented minors pending guardian transfer. Her claim isn't verified yet." "Then verify it," Vrei said. "Don't scan a 14-year-old for a classification that only matters if the claim fails." Kalich turned to look at her fully then, and whatever had been banked and patient in him for the past 2 days came up closer to the surface, close enough that she saw, for the first time, exactly how much he had already decided about this file before either of them had walked into the room. "You've spent more hours on one unregistered minor than the directorate pays either of us to spend," he said, quiet enough that it was almost pleasant, which was somehow worse than if he'd raised his voice. "I'd ask you to consider why, Solane, except I think we both already know the answer, and I don't think it's one that's going to look good on either of our records if this file goes sideways and someone asks." "Run the verification," Vrei said. "That's the whole disagreement. Run it before you scan her, not after." He didn't answer that directly. He turned back to the cell and to Lark, who had gone very still and very quiet through the entire exchange in exactly the way Vrei had come to recognize as the girl's version of bracing, and said, in a voice gone flat and procedural, "Stand up, arms out. This will take 4 minutes." What happened next took closer to 2 seconds, and Vrei would spend a considerable amount of time afterward trying to reconstruct it accurately, because her own memory of it kept compressing the sequence into something that felt less like watching an event, and more like watching a demonstration someone had rehearsed 100 times and performed once exactly, for an audience of 2. Kalich reached for the scanning wand at his belt and stepped into the cell's open front to close the 4 feet of distance between himself and the girl, and Lark moved, not away from him, not in any of the directions Vrei's training would have predicted from someone cornered by an armed enforcer twice her size, but into him, one economical half-step that put her inside the reach of his extending arm before the wand had cleared its holster. Her hand catching his wrist at an angle that had nothing to do with strength and everything to do with leverage, her other hand coming up under his elbow in the same motion, and Kalich's own weight did the rest, folding him forward and down with a controlled, almost gentle inevitability, until he was on one knee with his arm locked at a joint that would break cleanly and immediately if she added 4 more degrees of pressure to a hold that was, Vrei registered with a distant, clinical part of her mind, even as the rest of it was still catching up to what she'd just seen, not currently causing him any injury at all. Lark held it for exactly as long as it took to say, in a voice that hadn't risen at all, "I didn't consent to the scan," and then let go, stepped back to the far wall of the cell, and put both hands up, open, empty, at shoulder height, the universal posture of someone declaring themselves finished before anyone else in the room had decided whether the situation was over. The whole exchange had taken, by Vrei's later estimate, reviewing the corridor's own recording twice, 1.8 seconds, start to finish, including the half-second where Lark had raised her hands. Kalich came up off his knee with his face gone a color Vrei had never seen an Ithran's skin do before, somewhere between fury and something that looked, underneath the fury, uncomfortably close to fear, and reached for the restraint clip on his belt, and it was Vrei who stepped between them, one hand flat against his chest, not a large gesture, not a dramatic one, just enough presence in the doorway that he would have had to physically move her to reach the girl. "She's unarmed and she's standing down," Vrei said. "You're not clipping a minor for defending herself against an unauthorized procedure she'd already declined consent for on the record. Report yourself to medical, Kalich. You're not hurt. You're going to want it on file that you weren't, before anyone starts asking what actually happened in here." He looked at her for a long moment, breathing hard, and then at the girl standing very still against the far wall with her hands still open at her sides, watching both of them with the flat, patient attention of someone waiting to find out which direction the next 4 seconds were going to go. And something in his expression closed over, deliberate and cold, in a way that told Vrei, not yet in words she could have put on a report, but with total certainty all the same, that whatever came next from Dorn Kalich was not going to come through the front door of the Directorate's normal channels. "Note the incident," he said, and his voice had gone very level, very controlled, in a register Vrei liked considerably less than his earlier anger. "I'm sure it'll read exactly the way you want it to." He left without another word, and Vrei stood in the cell's open front for a long moment afterward, looking at a 14-year-old girl who had just disabled a trained compliance enforcer in under 2 seconds without breaking a single bone she hadn't chosen to leave unbroken, and felt, for the first time in 4 years on the real verge border, the specific, cold recalibration of someone realizing that everything she thought she understood about a category of person had just proven to be built on nothing but the fact that she'd never actually seen one of them tested. She pulled the asset channel processing logs before she pulled anything else, that same hour, because she needed to know exactly what the classification she'd just stopped Kalich from applying actually did to the people it was applied to. And the answer sat in a database she had never had cause to open in 4 years of service. 11 human miners had been routed through the resilience marker origin populations, channel across the real verge region in the 18 months since the bulletin's issue, each file terminating, after intake, in a transfer record to one of 3 licensed bioresearch consortia, and no further documentation of any kind, no medical follow-up, no welfare check, no closure note, just a transfer stamp and a processing fee logged against the receiving consortium's account. The most recent entry, 4 months old, was a boy of 12 named in the record only by intake number, flagged by an enforcer at a different waypoint under circumstances Vrei found, reading the sparse file twice, uncomfortably close to Lark's own. Undocumented, alone, a settlement history the enforcer's own notes had described as consistent with elevated adaptive markers, without ever specifying what those markers were beyond the fact that the boy had survived something the enforcer clearly hadn't bothered to ask more about. There was no record of what had happened to him afterward. There was no record of what had happened to any of the 11. That absence sat in Vrei's chest for a long time after she'd closed the log, heavier than anything in the file itself, because it told her with total clarity exactly what processing meant once a person crossed from the repatriation side of the ledger to the asset side of it, and exactly how close Lark Dunmore had come, in one 4-minute scan she never consented to becoming a 12th blank entry in the same column. She pulled the Kestrel Hollow file properly that night, off shift, in the small cluttered office she kept at the waypoint, and stayed with it long past the hour any reasonable enforcer would have gone home. The Directorate's regional archive held 40 years of incident summaries on Tier 3 deathworld settlements along the real verge, most of them thin, procedural, the kind of file that existed to satisfy an audit requirement rather than to inform anyone of anything. Kestrel Hollows was not thin. 6 raid incursions in 9 years generated its own weight of paperwork, but it was the older material that held Vrei's attention past midnight. A liaison officer's field log from 22 years earlier, filed by a conquered frontier contact named Avrith Cass, who had spent 4 transit months embedded with the settlement during its founding decade, and had written, in the dry, unadorned prose of someone who'd clearly expected no one to ever read the entry closely, a single passage that Vrei found herself reading 3 times before she moved on. The Settlement Council operates a defense doctrine locally referred to as the Long Watch, developed and taught by settlement founders with prior military service, emphasizing restraint, terrain awareness, and minimum force resolution over direct confrontation. This office's initial assessment characterized the doctrine as inadequate against organized raid tactics, given the settlement's lack of standing armament. This office's assessment has been revised twice in 4 months, following 2 incidents in which unarmed civilian defenders, including, on one occasion, 3 settlement children under the age of 13, resolved armed incursions without Concord assistance and with minimal casualties on either side. This office notes, for the benefit of any future liaison assigned to a Tier 3 Deathworld post, that the standard Concord threat model for human-origin settlements consistently underestimates the operational competence of populations who have had no reasonable expectation of timely outside protection for their entire recorded history, and recommends this assessment be considered doctrine rather than anecdote before the next liaison rotation, repeats this office's own initial error. A phrase in local use among settlement adults bears repeating here, offered without further comment: never corner the quiet ones. This office initially took it for a folk saying. It no longer does. Vrei sat with that passage for a long time after she'd finished reading it, and then pulled the casualty summary from the 7th incursion. The registry office raid, 11 days before Lark Dunmore crossed the Verge boundary alone, and found Rise Dunmore's name listed among 4 settlement casualties, with a note appended by the regional office confirming that the Scarrow Combine raid element responsible had, according to a partial identification from a surviving witness, been commanded by an operative the Combine's own internal communications referred to only by call sign, Harrow. The witness statement was unattributed in the file, redacted at the source's own request for safety, dated 3 days after the raid. 2 days before Lark Dunmore had walked 11 kilometers to a supply relay and asked an old freight pilot to carry her across the border on the strength of her grandfather's name. Vrei looked at the redacted witness statement for a long time, and then closed the file, and did not, that night, let herself finish the thought that had started forming somewhere underneath the fatigue and the cold, careful part of her mind that had spent 4 years learning to distrust exactly this kind of coincidence. She found Thrace in the logistics bay the next morning before shift and asked him, without preamble, what he knew about the Scarrow Combine's operating pattern along the outer verge. He gave her a long look before answering, the look of a man recalibrating a conversation he'd thought was going to be about something else entirely. More than the regional briefings admit, he said. They're not raiders in the old sense, not really. Raiders take what's in front of them and leave. The Combine runs a tribute model. They hit a Tier 3 settlement once, hard enough to hurt, and then they come back with a demand. Pay a standing tax or the next visit's worse. Most Tier 3 colonies pay it because the Concord's own response time makes the math simple. Kestrel Hollow's one of maybe 6 settlements on the whole verge that's refused 3 separate demands and is still standing to talk about it. He turned a supply chit over in his hands, not really looking at it. That doesn't happen without the Combine deciding, eventually, that a settlement like that stops being a revenue problem and starts being a discipline problem. You don't let one holdout keep holding out. It gives the other Tier 3 colonies ideas. And the raid commander, Vrei said, Coulson Harrow. I've heard the name twice in 4 years. Both times in incident reports I wasn't supposed to have access to, Thrace said. He runs the Combine's punitive strikes personally, which most Combine leadership doesn't bother doing. It's beneath them, usually, once they're senior enough to delegate it. Harrow doesn't delegate the ones that are meant to send a message. If Kestrel Hollow's registry office went down 11 days before your girl crossed the border, and Harrow commanded it personally, that's not an ordinary resource denial raid. That's a settlement being made an example of. He set the chit down and looked at her directly. If she's the only living witness who can put a name to that face, Vrei, I wouldn't want to be the one holding her file right now either. She went back to holding Block C 2 mornings later with a different question than the one she'd asked before, and found Kalich already gone from the waypoint on what the duty roster listed. With a blandness she was beginning to actively distrust in every form it took, as off-station liaison business, unscheduled. He had been off-comm for 6 hours the previous night, according to the waypoint's own duty log, during a window that overlapped almost exactly with an unregistered transmission burst the station's outer relay had logged, and per standard low-priority protocol, not flagged for review. Lark was where she always was, cross-legged on the cot, and something in her posture when Vrei came in told her, before either of them said anything, that 4 days in a holding cell had worn a thinner groove in the girl's composure than the girl herself would have admitted to. "You're the witness," Vrei said, "not a question. The redacted statement in the regional file, partial identification of the raid commander, that was you." Lark's stillness this time had a different quality to it than any of the previous ones. Not bracing, not rationing, but something closer to relief. The specific relief of a person who has been carrying a fact alone long enough that having someone else finally arrive at it feels, for one unguarded moment, like being allowed to put something down. "I saw his face for about 6 seconds, through the registry office window before I ran for the cellar," she said. "He wasn't wearing his mask when the breach went in. I don't know if that was carelessness or if he just didn't think it mattered because he wasn't planning on leaving witnesses. I gave the statement to the settlement's liaison contact the day before I left and asked her to redact my name from it, because I was 14 and alone and about to cross 9 light years of contested space by myself, and I did not think it was a good idea to be a documented, named threat to a raid commander who was still operating in the same sector I'd be traveling through. And now you're sitting in a Concord holding facility," Vrei said slowly, working through it in real time, "under a file that a directorate enforcer with an undisclosed communication pattern to unregistered transmission sources has spent 4 days trying to reclassify as an unregistered asset instead of a documented refugee minor." "I don't know anything about that part," Lark said. "I only know the part where I saw his face." Vrei stood very still in the middle of the cell's open front, feeling the shape of the last 4 days rearrange itself around a center she hadn't let herself look at directly until this exact moment, and understood, with the particular cold clarity that came, in her experience, right before something went very wrong very quickly, that she had spent 4 days treating this as a bureaucratic irregularity when it had, from the first hour, been something considerably more dangerous than that. And that whatever Kalich had spent the last 6 off-comm hours arranging was very unlikely to still be a paperwork problem by morning. It came at the hour the waypoint's own duty logs would later record as 2:47 station time, a full breach charge against holding Block C's outer service door, instead of the front entrance any legitimate transfer would have used. And Vrei was 3 corridors away reviewing the transmission logs a second time when the alarm went up, close enough to reach the block in under 90 seconds and far enough that 90 seconds was, by any reasonable measure, already too long. She came through the service corridor into a scene her training had prepared her for in theory, and nothing in 4 years on the real verge border had prepared her for in practice. 2 Scarrow Combine operatives already through the breached door, armored, weapons up, moving with the brisk, professional economy of people executing a plan rather than improvising one, and between them and the cell where Lark Dunmore had spent 4 days being systematically underestimated, exactly one small, unarmed 14-year-old girl who had not run for the corridor's far exit, which was open and clear behind her, and had instead put herself between the breach and an unconscious duty clerk, Perrin Ask, a quiet, unremarkable man Vrei had shared a night shift with dozens of times, and knew mostly as someone who kept a photo of his 2 children propped against his console, slumped against the wall where the first operative's opening shot had caught him across the shoulder. What happened over the following 40 seconds was not, Vrei would understand later, anything like the 2-second demonstration in the cell 4 days earlier, though it drew from the same source, not a display of restraint calibrated to disable without harming, because these were not enforcers overstepping a scan protocol. These were raiders with weapons up and killing intent, and the long watch, Vrei understood watching it, had never been built only for gentleness. It had been built. From the first drill, a 5-year-old learned on a cold morning in Kestrel Hollow, for exactly this: to take from an attacker whatever margin his weapon and his size and his confidence had bought him, and close it fast, before he understood the margin was already gone. Lark went low, and inside the first operative's reach, the instant his weapon tracked toward the clerk instead of her. Inside the effective range, where a rifle's own length worked against the person holding it, and had the weapon turned back on its owner before he'd finished registering that the target he'd walked in expecting to find cowering had instead closed the distance to nothing at all. The second operative got off one shot that scored a burning line across Vrei's own shoulder as she came through the corridor door at a dead run, and then Vrei was in it too, driving her own weight into him before he could correct his aim, and for a handful of chaotic, close-quarters seconds the two of them worked the narrow corridor together with no plan beyond the plan the space itself demanded. Vrei's training filling the gaps in Lark's smaller reach, Lark's speed filling the gaps in Vrei's larger frame, an improvised partnership between a compliance enforcer and an unarmed 14-year-old that should not, by any doctrine Vrei had ever been taught, have worked as cleanly as it did. There was a moment, near the middle of it, that Vrei would return to more than any other when she replayed the corridor afterward. Not the disarms, not the speed, but a half-second where the operative she was grappling got a hand free and reached, unmistakably, for the sidearm holstered at his hip instead of the rifle he'd already lost. And Lark, still fully engaged with her own opponent, without turning to look, without any visible break in what she was doing, put her heel into the side of his knee hard enough to fold it sideways and take the reach out of the equation before his fingers had closed on the grip. She had not needed to see it happen to know it was happening. She had simply already been listening for it, the way a person listens for a floorboard they know creaks, and Vrei understood, watching it, that whatever the long watch actually was, it was not a set of moves a person performed one at a time. It was an entire way of occupying a room that never fully switched off, drilled so deep into a body that the body kept running it even when its owner's attention was somewhere else entirely. It ended with both operatives disarmed and restrained. The second one, the one who'd grazed Vrei's shoulder, restrained by Lark herself with a hold identical in principle to the one she'd used on Kalich 4 days earlier, exact and controlled, and stopping precisely at the point of pain rather than past it, even with a burning shoulder wound of her own from a shot that had caught her across the forearm in the corridor's chaos, and that she had apparently decided in the moment was not important enough to slow her down for, and with a third operative, the one who'd been covering the corridor's far end, breaking for the service door the instant it became clear the extraction had failed, running not toward the cell block but toward the waypoint's outer dock, where the duty log would later confirm a personal transport had been cleared for unscheduled departure 6 minutes earlier by an authorization code belonging to first-rank Enforcer Dorn Kalich. He did not make it to the transport. Waypoint security, alerted by the same alarm that had brought Vrei running, intercepted him at the dock's outer lock, and it was there, in the transport's own comm log, seized before he could purge it, that the 6 off-comm hours from 2 nights earlier resolved into exactly what Vrei had been afraid to finish thinking through. A payment authorization, routed through 3 shell accounts and 1 genuinely careless final transfer, from a Scarrow Combine financial cutout to a personal account belonging to Dorn Kalich, timestamped 4 hours before the breach, for services described, with a bureaucratic euphemism that made Vrei's jaw tighten every time she read it afterward, as asset location and access facilitation. Kestrel Hollow witness matter. Medical cleared Vrei's shoulder with a synth flesh patch, and a mild sedative she declined to take, and it was nearly an hour before she found her way to the small recovery bay, where Lark sat on the edge of a cot with her forearm freshly wrapped, watching a directorate medic pack away a field kit with the same unhurried, cataloging attention she brought to everything else, as though the room itself were still a set of exits worth counting. "Ask stable," Vrei said before Lark could ask because she'd clearly been about to. "Shoulder wound clean through, no organ involvement. He'll be back on shift inside 3 weeks complaining about the paperwork." Something in the girl's shoulders came down, fractionally, at that, not relief exactly, or not only relief, but the specific unclenching of someone who had been holding a second, quieter fear in reserve underneath the larger one. "I didn't know his name until you said it in the corridor," she said. "I didn't know anything about him. I just knew he was down and they were between him and the exit, and that was enough." "It usually is," Vrei said, and sat down on the empty cot across from her, feeling, for the first time since the alarm had gone up, the full weight of the last 2 hours settle into her own body all at once, the particular delayed exhaustion of adrenaline finishing its work. "How's the arm?" "It'll scar." Lark turned it over, examining the wrap with clinical detachment. He said, "Clean through, muscle only. I've had worse from the watch drills themselves, honestly. My grandfather wasn't gentle about the failure passes." She looked up, and for a moment the discipline slipped enough that Vrei saw something rower underneath it, not fear still, but a kind of stunned aftershock, the look of someone realizing, now that the room had stopped moving, exactly how close the last hour had actually come to going a different way. "I keep doing the math on it. If you'd been on the other side of the station, if Ask had been standing somewhere else, if I'd frozen for even a second at the door instead of moving." "You didn't freeze." "I know I didn't. I'm asking why I didn't. I've never actually had to find that part out about myself before tonight. I always assumed I would when it counted, because everyone assumes that about themselves until they don't." She was quiet for a moment, turning the wrapped arm slightly in the light. "I think I understand now why he never wanted me to actually use any of it. It's not that he doubted I could. It's that finding out you can is its own kind of loss. You don't get to be a person who's never had to know that about herself afterward. I'm not anymore. I don't think I get that back." Vrei didn't have a tidy answer for that and didn't try to manufacture one, because she had learned enough about this particular 14-year-old over the preceding 5 days to know that a tidy answer would land as an insult. "No," she said instead. "You don't get that back. I don't think anyone who's ever actually needed a skill like yours gets it back, whatever species they are. But you get to decide what you carry forward from tonight instead, and from where I was standing, what you carried was a wounded man to safety and a hold that stopped exactly where you meant it to stop, even bleeding, even afraid. That's not nothing to carry forward. Some people carry a great deal less, out of nights considerably easier than this one." Lark held her gaze for a long moment and then, unexpectedly, reached over and closed her uninjured hand around Vrei's wrist. Not a hold, nothing tactical about it at all, just contact, brief and deliberate, the kind of gesture Vrei suspected the girl didn't offer often. "Thank you for coming back down that corridor," she said. "I already said that. I don't think I said it right the first time." "You said it exactly right," Vrei said. "I heard it." The Directorate's regional office opened a formal inquiry within the week, and Vrei gave her statement 3 times to 3 different review boards, each time with the same flat, exact account of what she'd seen, because she had learned, over 4 days of watching a 14-year-old ration her own story to people who hadn't yet earned it, exactly how much a plain, unembellished account was worth against people inclined to disbelieve it anyway. Kalich's defense, delivered through a directorate advocate with the particular smoothness of someone paid well to make an ugly thing sound survivable, rested almost entirely on the classification bulletin, on the argument that he had believed, in good faith, that Lark Dunmore represented an unregistered resilience marker asset whose processing fell under a legitimate directorate revenue channel, and that his subsequent panic and flight, while regrettable, did not retroactively prove corrupt intent in the original assessment. It was a careful argument, built on real ambiguity in a real bulletin that Vrei had disliked from the first time she'd read it, and she understood, giving her third statement, that it might very well have worked, against a review board inclined to protect the bulletin along with the enforcer who'd used it, if the transport comm log hadn't existed at all. The board's presiding officer, a senior Ithran administrator named Corveth Ale, who Vrei had met exactly once before, in an unrelated audit years earlier, pressed her on the same point 3 separate times across the second hearing, in the patient, circling way Ithran review boards were trained to test a statement for cracks. "You're describing a 14-year-old who disabled a trained enforcer in under 2 seconds, Ale said, and you're asking this board to conclude that the appropriate response was to treat her as a documented refugee rather than flag her for further assessment. Explain the reasoning, Enforcer Solane, not the outcome." "The reasoning is that capability isn't the same question as intent," Vrei said. "She used exactly enough force to stop an unauthorized procedure, and not 1 degree more twice, in 2 entirely different levels of danger, 4 days apart. If this board is going to build a classification around what a person is capable of doing, it needs a parallel classification for what they consistently choose to do with it, or the bulletin isn't measuring threat at all. It's measuring fear." Ale was quiet for a long moment, turning a stylus over between 2 fingers in a gesture Vrei recognized, uncomfortably, as her own. "That's not a legal argument, Enforcer." "No," Vrei agreed. "It's the true one. I'll leave the legal argument to the advocates. I was asked what I saw." It did exist. The review board's findings, issued 11 days after the raid, terminated Kalich's commission, referred the payment record to a joint Concord Directorate Anti-Trafficking Office for prosecution, and included, in a footnote Vrei read 4 times with a satisfaction she allowed herself only privately, a formal recommendation that the Resilience Marker Origin Populations bulletin be suspended pending full review, on the grounds that its ambiguous language had proven in this instance directly exploitable in service of conduct. The bulletin was never intended to authorize, and did nothing adequate to prevent. Vrei wrote her own supplementary report the same week, off the clock, longer than any report she'd filed in 4 years, and did not soften any of it. She wrote about the 2-second hold in the cell that had ended with an armed enforcer on his knee, and an unarmed girl's hands already raised before anyone asked her to raise them. She wrote about the 40 seconds in the service corridor, about a 14-year-old who had put herself between a breach and an unconscious clerk instead of running for a clear exit, about a hold that had stopped exactly at the point of pain, and not 1 degree past it, even while its owner was bleeding from her own arm. She wrote at the end of it, a single paragraph she rewrote 4 times before she was satisfied it said what she meant instead of what would be easiest for a review board to skim past, and she did not, this time, need an old liaison officer's field log to find the words for it, because she had watched them prove true herself, at close range, with her own shoulder still healing under a field dressing. This office's threat assessment training consistently frames deathworld origin populations as a risk category defined by visible aggression or documented combat history. That framing failed this office completely in the present case, and the record suggests it has failed consistently, for decades, along this entire border. The subject of this file presented, by every visible indicator the Directorate trains its enforcers to weigh, as harmless, small, quiet, cooperative, alone. She was, in fact, the most capable individual present in either of the 2 incidents this report describes, not despite that appearance but very nearly because of it, because a population that has never had the luxury of assuming help will arrive in time does not raise its children to look dangerous. It raises them to survive being underestimated, which is a considerably harder skill, and a considerably more dangerous one to build a policy around misreading. This office recommends the Directorate stop asking what a deathworld origin arrival looks like capable of, and start asking what she has already had to become. She flew Lark Dunmore to Halworth Reach herself, 3 transit days out, because the Directorate's standard repatriation escort roster had a 2-week backlog, and because she had, by the time the inquiry closed, stopped pretending to herself that she was volunteering out of anything as simple as procedural diligence. They didn't talk much for the first day of the transit. Lark spent most of it at the small viewport in the transport's forward cabin, watching the Verge's scattered border lights slide past, her bandaged forearm resting in her lap, the folding knife with the worn bone handle that had turned out to be the only thing she'd carried out of Kestrel Hollow besides the clothes on her back, turning slowly between her fingers in the particular absent, grounding way Vrei had come to recognize over the transit's second day, as the closest the girl came to visibly grieving anything at all. The attack came in the dead hours between the first and second day, in the empty stretch of border space between 2 beacon relays, where Vrei had deliberately kept the flight plan off any scheduled lane a Combine tracker might have thought worth watching. A precaution that turned out within the hour to have been aimed at the wrong kind of threat entirely, because whoever had found them had not needed to watch the lanes at all. They had pulled the transit manifest directly from a Directorate logistics system that should have required 3 separate authorizations to access, using a clearance code that had not yet been revoked, because in 6 days of scrambling to process an ongoing inquiry, no one had thought to ask whether a detained enforcer's system access should have been suspended the hour he was detained rather than at the Directorate's usual tidy administrative pace. Vrei felt the ship shudder before the alarm even sounded, a hard, concussive jolt through the deck plating that had nothing to do with a hull breach and everything to do with a directed disabling charge against the drive coupling, precisely placed, the kind of shot that didn't kill a transport so much as strand it exactly where its attacker wanted it stranded. The cabin lights dropped to emergency red. Lark was on her feet before Vrei had finished processing the shudder, the folding knife with the worn bone handle already open in her hand, her eyes fixed on the forward viewport, where a second vessel's running lights were resolving out of the dark on a closing vector too precise, too unhurried, to be anything but deliberate. Combine cutter, Lark said, flat and exact, cataloging rather than fearing, the same register she'd used describing the wrist release to Kalich. Bigger than the 2 from the corridor, boarding configured, not strike configured. They didn't come to disable us and run. A shot like that is for holding a ship still long enough to walk onto it. How do you know the profile? Vrei said, already moving for the transport's small weapons locker, her shoulders healing synth-flesh patch pulling with a bright complaint she had no time to acknowledge. Because I've read every Combine incident file the Waypoint let me touch since the inquiry started, Lark said, not moving her eyes from the viewport. I told you. I don't get to be a person who doesn't already know this anymore. The cutter matched velocities and locked a boarding tube against the transport's forward hatch with a shudder Vrei felt in her teeth, and by the time the outer seal cycled, she had the locker open and a sidearm in each hand, one of which she held out to Lark without a word of debate she didn't have time to have. Lark took it, checked the charge with a competence that no longer surprised Vrei at all, and did not raise it, choosing instead to fall in behind the cabin's structural bulkhead, in a position that put the hatch's likely breach angle entirely outside her own exposure. A positioning decision Vrei recognized, watching her take it in under a second, as identical in spirit to the half-step that had put her inside Kalich's reach 4 days earlier. The girl had one instinct underneath all of them, Vrei thought, in the strange suspended clarity that came before violence. Close the distance the enemy thought was safe, and make it theirs instead. 3 operatives came through the breached hatch in close order, and behind them, unhurried, in no armor at all beyond a plain travel coat that made him look, For one disorienting half-second, like nothing more than an ordinary transit passenger, came a lean, gray-eyed man whose face Vrei recognized before he'd said a word. Because she had spent 4 days with a redacted witness statement's 6-second description, committed so thoroughly to memory that meeting the actual face felt less like a surprise and more like a prediction finally confirmed. "Harrow," Lark said, from behind the bulkhead, and there was nothing in her voice that Vrei could read as fear. Only the same flat, cataloging exactness she brought to a wrist release, applied now to a man instead of a hold. "You have good memory for someone who only had 6 seconds, Harrow said, and his voice was mild, almost pleasant, in a register Vrei recognized uncomfortably as close cousin to Kalich's smoothest lies. "I'm told you also disarmed 2 of my people without breaking a bone either of them needed. That's an impressive claim for a 14-year-old girl from a settlement with a hand-tool defense doctrine and no standing armament. I came to see it for myself, since the Combine's board has become extremely interested in exactly how a resource denial operation against one Tier 3 colony has cost us a payment record, a corrupted directorate enforcer, and now 2 operatives with nothing to show for it but a training film's worth of embarrassment. I intend to leave here with either your testimony erased or your body confirmed. The board did not specify which they preferred, and I find, honestly, that I don't much care either." "You should," Vrei said, stepping half out from cover with both weapons steady, putting herself in the angle that split his attention between 2 targets instead of 1. "Because everything you say in a boarding action against a directorate transport in transit gets logged automatically to the nearest relay the instant this hatch cycled, and it already has. Whatever you do in the next 60 seconds, you're doing it on the record." Something flickered behind Harrow's mild expression, not fear, not yet, but the first crack of a man recalculating a plan built on the assumption of no witnesses left standing to matter, and in the half-second his attention shifted fully onto Vrei, weighing the new variable. Lark moved. She came off the bulkhead low and fast, not toward Harrow, whom she had clearly already judged too far and too armed to close on directly, but into the nearest operative's flank, inside his weapon's arc before he'd finished registering that the exit path he'd expected to be clear had a 14-year-old girl standing in it instead of empty deck, and the 2 seconds it cost him to correct that assumption were 2 seconds he did not get back. Vrei fired twice, both shots aimed to disable rather than kill because some procedural corner of her mind was still running the review board's eventual questions even in the middle of the fight, and took a return shot across the same shoulder Kalich's incident had already left tender, hot and sharp enough to whiten the edges of her vision for 1 bad half-second, before training closed back over the pain and kept her upright. The corridor fight at the waypoint had taught her what Lark's version of violence looked like when it had room to breathe. The transport's cramped forward cabin gave her almost none of that room, and Vrei watched, in fragments too fast to fully track, Lark using the confinement itself as a weapon, turning the narrow gap between bulkhead and console into a choke point that let her fight 1 operative at a time no matter how many came through the hatch, taking a boarding knife slash across her already wrapped forearm without so much as a change of breath, disabling its owner's grip on the blade, with a motion so economical Vrei nearly missed it happening at all. It was Harrow who nearly ended it. He had held back through the opening exchange with the patient, unhurried attention of a man who had never once needed to rush his own violence, and when he finally moved it was not toward Lark at all, but toward Vrei, a fast, clean line across the cabin aimed at closing the gap before her second weapon could track him, a professional's read of the room that correctly identified the Ithran enforcer, not the human girl, as the more conventionally dangerous target in front of him. He was wrong about that in a way that cost him the fight, because Lark had already read the same gap he was crossing, and instead of finishing the operative in front of her, she let him go, a calculated, ugly trade Vrei only understood afterward, watching the recording, as the exact kind of cold arithmetic her grandfather's watch had built into her for exactly this situation, and closed the distance to Harrow's flank a full half-second before he reached Vrei. Taking his legs out from under him with the same low, economical redirect she'd used on Kalich, except this time there was nothing gentle held in reserve behind it, because a man reaching for an enforcer's throat with clear killing intent was not a scan she was declining consent for. He went down hard, the back of his skull cracking against the console edge with a sound that emptied the fight out of him in a single stroke, and Lark had his own sidearm out of his slack hand and pressed to the underside of his jaw before he'd finished losing consciousness, her breath coming fast for the first time since the hatch had cycled, her wrapped forearm dark with fresh blood through the old bandage, and held that position steady, controlled. Exactly as far from panic as she had been in the cell 4 days earlier, until the last operative standing dropped his own weapon and put his hands up without being told to, having watched, in the space of perhaps 90 seconds, his commander go down to a girl a third his size and decided, with the particular fast recalculation of a professional whose employer had stopped being worth dying for, that the fight was no longer his to finish. Vrei called it in with her good hand pressed hard against her own shoulder, the transport's short-range comm burst reaching the nearest relay station within the minute, and it was nearly 40 more before a conquered response cutter matched velocities and took Harrow and his surviving operative into custody, restrained, concussed, and Vrei noted, reading the transfer manifest later with a satisfaction she allowed herself without apology, very much alive. Because the joint anti-trafficking prosecution the review board had opened against Kalich's payment record needed exactly the kind of witness Harrow now was, whether he intended to cooperate with it or not. "You let him go," Vrei said afterward, once the response cutter had cleared and the forward cabin's emergency lighting had cycled back to normal, nodding at the blood soaking through Lark's rebandaged arm. "The one you were fighting. You could have finished him and gone for Harrow after." "I did the math in about 1/10 of a second," Lark said, sitting very still while Vrei worked a fresh field dressing around the wound with hands that had not entirely stopped shaking. "He was already losing. Harrow wasn't. If Harrow reached you before I reached him, the math on the whole fight changes because you're the one keeping a channel open to the relay. I wasn't protecting you because I like you, not in that second. I was protecting the plan." She looked up, something almost apologetic in it. "That sounds worse out loud than it felt at the time." "It sounds," Vrei said, tying off the dressing, "exactly like something your grandfather would have done the math on the same way, in the same 1/10 of a second, and never once apologized for afterward. Don't apologize to me for choosing correctly under fire. I'd rather have a partner who does the math than one who feels good about not doing it." Lark held very still for a moment, watching her, and then let out a breath that had clearly been held since the hatch first shuddered, the discipline cracking for just long enough to let something rower through, not tears, not quite, but close enough to their shape that Vrei didn't comment on it and simply kept working, giving the girl the privacy of not being watched too closely, while she found her way back to composure on her own schedule rather than anyone else's. "He'd be embarrassed," Lark said, on the second evening, once both of them had slept off the worst of the adrenaline crash and Vrei had logged the incident report and confirmed twice that Harrow's transfer to conquered custody had cleared without complication, apropos of nothing, when Vrei brought a meal tray up to the viewport seat without being asked. "My grandfather. About the corridor and now this too. He always said the whole point of the watch was to never need it in front of anyone." "He'd be wrong," Vrei said, and meant it more plainly than she'd meant almost anything in 4 years of careful, procedural directorate language. "You put yourself between a breach and an unconscious man you didn't know, with a wound already open in your own arm, instead of taking a clear exit that was standing right behind you. I've read the incident report from every angle a review board could think to ask for. There isn't a version of it where you did anything except exactly what your grandfather spent 9 years teaching you to do, in exactly the moment it mattered." Lark didn't answer that immediately, turning the knife over once more in her hands, and when she finally spoke it was quieter and closer, Vrei thought, to the actual 14-year-old underneath 4 days of rationed composure and a lifetime of drilled restraint than anything she'd said since the cell. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't come back down that corridor," she said. "I could have held 2 of them, maybe. I don't know about 3. "You didn't have to find out," Vrei said. "That's what a partner's for." Lark was quiet for a while after that, watching the border lights, and when she spoke again it was in a different register entirely, curious rather than guarded. "Why did you actually stay in the room that first morning? You didn't have to sit in on Kalich's interview. Thrace told me later most enforcers wouldn't have." Vrei considered the question longer than it probably warranted, because the honest answer had taken her the better part of a week to work out for herself. "Ithrans are trained almost from birth to read danger through a very narrow set of signals," she said finally. "Raised voices, sudden motion, visible loss of control. It makes us good at a great many things, and it makes us nearly useless at recognizing the kind of person who has learned to be dangerous quietly, because we've never had to be. I read your file and it didn't match any signal I'd been trained to look for, and some part of me, not the trained part, the part underneath it, wanted to know why a file that quiet could still make a senior enforcer move as fast as Kalich was moving to close it. I didn't have a procedural reason. I had a feeling I couldn't file a report on. I stayed anyway." "That's not very Ithran of you," Lark said, and there was something almost warm in it. "No," Vrei agreed. "It's very possibly the least Ithran thing I've done in 9 years of service. I intend to keep doing it." They reached Halworth Reach on the 3rd day, a modest agricultural settlement built into the shoulder of a long river valley, green in a way that made Vrei, whose species had evolved under a colder, drier sky, briefly understand why humans wrote so much about places like it. Vera Ashcombe was waiting at the transit dock before the ramp had finished lowering, alerted 3 hours earlier by a message Vrei had sent ahead herself rather than leave to standard notification channels. And the sound she made when Lark came down the ramp was not a word in any language Vrei's translator registered cleanly. Just a raw, unguarded noise that closed the distance between them faster than either woman seemed to consciously decide to move. Vrei stood back at the ramp's foot and let it happen without inserting herself into it, the way she had learned, over 3 transit days, to let a great many things happen around Lark Dunmore without inserting herself. Vera Ashcombe found her there a few minutes later, while Lark was still gathering the small bag of belongings the directorate had issued her, and studied Vrei for a long moment with an expression that had clearly been assembling itself the whole walk down the dock. She was younger than Vrei had pictured from the file, mid-30s, work-roughened hands, a face that resembled her sister's in the photograph on record closely enough that Vrei understood, immediately, some of what it must have cost Lark to see it for the first time in person. "Your message said she was safe," Vera said. "It didn't say safe from what?" "I've spent 3 hours since then imagining a great many answers to that question, Enforcer Solane, most of them worse than whatever the truth turns out to be." "Truth is bad enough without embellishment," Vrei said, and gave her the essential shape of it plainly, the way she'd have wanted it given to her: the raid, the witness statement, the corridor, leaving out only the details that belonged to Lark to share or not share in her own time. Vera listened without interrupting, her jaw tightening at certain points and nowhere else, a woman absorbing a blow the way people absorbed blows when they intended to still be standing afterward for someone who needed them standing. "She's 14, Vera said finally, quietly, not a question, not quite an accusation either. More the same disbelief Vrei herself had carried for most of the past week, worn down now into something closer to grief. "She is," Vrei agreed. "She's also the reason 3 people are alive tonight who otherwise wouldn't be, myself included. I'd ask you not to let the first fact make you forget the second, in the months ahead, however much you'd both like to." She's going to need someone who can hold both at once. Vera looked past her down the dock, to where Lark was watching them with the same careful, assessing attention she brought to every room she entered, and something in the older woman's face steadied, resolve settling over the grief the way frost settles over standing water. "I can do that," she said. "I've had 34 years of practice being the sister who worries about the wrong things first and gets to the right ones eventually. I'll get there faster this time." She held out her hand, the local custom rather than the conquered gesture, and Vrei took it. "Thank you for flying her here yourself instead of putting her on a transfer manifest." "She earned better than a manifest," Vrei said, and it was Lark, eventually, disentangling herself from a second, briefer embrace with her aunt with the same economical, deliberate care she brought to everything, who came back down the dock to where Vrei was still standing. "You didn't have to fly me here yourself," she said. "No," Vrei agreed. "I wanted to see it through to somewhere real, instead of handing you off at a transfer point and reading about the rest in a file." Lark considered that for a moment, and then did something Vrei hadn't fully anticipated, which was to hold out her hand, not the local custom, Vrei knew, but a conquered gesture, the kind exchanged between officials closing a formal matter, offered with a deliberateness that told Vrei the girl had chosen it precisely, because it was the register she wanted this goodbye to carry. "Thank you for reading the transcript a third time," Lark said. "Most people stop at the first version." Vrei took the offered hand, and found it steadier than her own had been at several points over the preceding week. "There's an old officer's note in the Kestrel Hollow file," she said. 22 years old, a liaison who spent 4 months in your settlement before either of us was born and figured out something about it that the rest of the directorate never bothered to write down properly until I did it myself last week. There's a phrase in there, 'Never corner the quiet ones.'" She held the girl's hand a moment longer than the gesture strictly required. "I used to think that was a saying about danger. I don't think that anymore. I think it's a saying about exactly how much a person can survive without ever once needing to look like they've survived anything, and how badly the rest of the galaxy keeps underestimating what that costs to build. I intend to make sure my own directorate stops making that mistake. I can't promise the whole Concord will listen. I can promise I will." Lark looked at her for a long moment, something working behind the careful stillness that had guarded her through 4 days of a holding cell, and 40 seconds of a service corridor, and 3 days of a quiet transit grief she'd carried without once letting it become anything louder than the turn of a knife between her fingers. And then, for the first time since Vrei had met her, she smiled, small, real, unrationed, the smile of someone who had just been told, by an adult who had earned the right to say it, that the thing she'd spent her whole short life being was finally going to be seen for what it actually was, instead of what it looked like from a safe distance. "Good," she said. "Somebody should." She turned and walked back up the dock to where her aunt was waiting, and Vrei stood at the ramp's foot a while longer, watching a small, unassuming, entirely ordinary-looking girl disappear into the arms of the one relative she had left in the galaxy, and thought, with a clarity that would stay with her for the rest of her career on the real Verge border, that she had spent 4 years answering calls about a species the Directorate's own training manuals insisted on treating as a hazard to be managed from a safe procedural distance, and that the single most dangerous, most capable, most quietly devastating person she had ever stood beside in a firefight had been 14 years old, unarmed, bleeding from her own arm, and had looked, every single time anyone bothered to actually look at her, like absolutely nothing to be afraid of at all. That, she thought, boarding the transport for the long flight back to Corval Waypoint alone, was very probably the whole point, and had been the whole point for as long as humans had needed it to be. And she did not think, watching Halworth Reach fall away behind the viewport, that the rest of the galaxy was going to catch up to that fact any faster than she had. But she intended from here on to be the kind of enforcer who no longer needed to be shown twice.